again. Today we're going to make some shaker doors.
So I'm thinking about the time how it goes fast. Thinking about the smile and I wish it would have lasted. Thinking about love, thinking about her, thinking about a girl and the time we shared the world. Thinking about harmony, what a rarity. Think of what it means to me.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in. This is Richard. You're watching Cabinet Wise. Mulder's sitting here in the corner. He's monitoring the situation. And today we're going to make some shaker doors. So nestle in with your coffee and your slippers, and we will do this together. Now, for the experienced cabinet maker out there, all of this is going to seem very elementary, but my goal is to help those who perhaps haven't done much woodworking before, and I want to show that really anyone can do it. And you don't need too many fancy pieces of machinery either. I mean, sure, I'm a professional cabinet maker and I have the table saw and the radial arm saw, but overall this is actually a pretty old school shop, and a lot can be done with very simple tools. Aside from a table saw and some sort of chop saw, all you really need is a couple of routers and router bits, which I'll show you in a few minutes, and you're well on your way. Oh, and don't forget the clamps and the glue. So let's get down to business. What I'm doing here is I'm ripping up the stiles and the rails. These doors are paint grade, so I'm making the frames out of alder S2S 1-edge straight, which means the lumber company, well, they mill it for me. Saves me some time. This particular alder hardwood is called 4/4. 4/4 make up 1 inch, but it's actually not 1 inch thick. It's 13/16. Go figure. After running them through the joiner, I'm going to plane them down to a 3/4 thickness because I want these doors to finish out at 3/4 thick. Those pieces are the stiles. They're ripped at 2 1/4 wide. The pieces sitting on top of the planer there are 5 inches wide. That will provide enough material for the top and the bottom rail. The reason I leave it wider like that is because it's much easier to run the end grain of the wood through the router to create the tongue portion of the tongue and groove when it's a wider piece. And now that I know all the depth settings are correct on the router tables, I can route the grooves in each style. This set of router bits I'm using is specifically made for shaker doors. It is a shaker door router bit set, which I recommend finding. It has all kinds of adjustments for panel thickness and all kinds of settings for the height and depths you want the panel to sit within the stile and rail. I usually set it 5/16 back from the face, 1/4 inch for the center panel, and then that leaves 3/16 space remaining. And next I'll run the rails. This is the top and the bottom rail in this chunk of material. Like I said, I left this wide at 5 inches, and then I'll flip it over and do the other side. And after this, I'll take it to the table saw where I'll cut it down to 2 1/4 inches, just like the stiles. And now the tongues are routed in the top and the bottom rail. They're ripped down to 2 1/4 inches. Now I can route the groove. I'm going to make sure it's perfectly even and aligned with the tongue. That's very important. In order to assemble a perfectly flat door, you need to make sure the grooves are all even with each other and also even with the tongue. And for goodness sake, be sure to keep your router bits sharp. These got quite dull. I've used them a lot recently. I have a new set on the way. It hadn't arrived yet, so I figured, I'm going to do the video anyway. But yeah, there's a lot of burning here. You don't want that. Don't be like me. But nevertheless, we press on, and they're actually not too bad after all. You know what? I think they're just fine. And not only that, but it looks like we've fortunately made enough pieces, so we got that going for us. And here's some 1/4-inch maple plywood for the center panels. 1, 2. All right, now we're getting somewhere. And for the glue up, we have Titebond original wood glue. Glue up each tongue. And on the subject of tongues, no, this has nothing to do with kissing. I just wanted to point out that when you're cross-cutting your top and bottom rail, which you have ripped to 2 1/4 inches, make sure you add 7/8 to the total length, because you're going to have 7/16 on each side that goes into the groove on each style. So just something to remember. And as you're clamping, I prefer to use bar clamps. Make sure the door sits perfectly flat on the bar of the clamp. And then you're going to want to check the diagonals of the door to make sure that it's square before it's dry. If it's not, you can move the clamps right or left slightly to try to adjust the squareness. You're going to want to do that before it's dry. After it's dry, obviously, it will be too late. And then we're just going to let these dry for a minimum of 30 minutes, preferably an hour, before we sand them. Double checking that everything is sitting flat on the clamp. You want to just look below and make sure it's totally flat on that bar. Ding, they're done. Time to take them out of the clamps. And we're going to start off by doing a little belt sand action. And when you're belt sanding, it's very critical that you're holding it perfectly flat. It's very easy to round the corners or dip off the edge. You don't want that. And then ideally, if you're in the mood for it, I'd recommend flipping the door over and also doing the other side. And I know what you're gonna say, I don't have one of these sanders. Well, that's okay. Just use an orbital sander, which I'm about to do next, but it just so happens I have this sander, so it is nice to use to sand the edges. And speaking of the orbital sander, I use a pneumatic orbital. I'm going to just do a once over with 150 grit on the back of the door, then the front of the door, and then I'm going to go over it once again with 220 grit. Sanding and sanding. Be sure to wear a mask. And as always, I appreciate those who watched, and especially those who watched to the end. Perhaps if you feel so inclined, give it a like, subscribe, tell your friends, family, acquaintances, co-workers. And until next time, this is Richard and Mulder signing off, and I look forward to doing it again.